A poor man buys a dilapidated house with his last money deep in the forest. Everyone laughs at him and mocks him, but what he finds inside changes his life forever and shocks everyone. Subscribe now and comment below where you are watching this video from. He had not planned to buy anything that morning, let alone a collapsing structure hidden at the edge of a forgotten forest road. The decision arrived the way exhaustion arrives, not in a burst of emotion, but as a quiet surrender to the idea that whatever life he had been defending until now no longer deserved his loyalty. For years, he had tried to live in ways that would be understood by people who had already decided not to understand him. He worked harder than anyone expected, spoke more carefully than anyone else needed to, smiled when silence would have been easier, and each day still ended with the same invisible wall between himself and the world he moved through. Losing his job felt less like a tragedy and more like a confirmation. When the landlord sent the notice, there was no anger left to summon. He packed what fit into his car and drove without a destination, as if motion alone might prove that he still existed. The ad appeared on his phone while he was parked outside a gas station that smelled of old coffee and leaking fuel. It was a single blurry photo attached to a few words that barely tried to sell anything. Old house for sale, structure unstable, cash only. The price was low enough to look like a typo. He zoomed in on the picture and saw a building that looked less like a house and more like something the forest had rejected. The roof sagged inward, windows stared like empty sockets, vines wrapped around the walls as if claiming them back. He should have laughed and scrolled past. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar tug, a sensation closer to recognition than curiosity. Without thinking about the consequences, he tapped the number. The road to the house narrowed into a track where the gravel gave way to dirt, then to something that was barely road at all. Trees crowded in from both sides, branches brushing the roof of his car like hands testing a stranger. By the time he reached the clearing, he had lost cell service, and with it, the last tether to the life he was leaving behind. The house stood alone, leaning slightly to one side, its boards darkened by decades of rain and neglect. Moss climbed the lower walls in thick green mats, and ivy threaded through broken window frames like veins. It did not look abandoned so much as it looked tired. The man who met him there spoke as if the place were already gone. He did not invite him inside or tell stories about the past. He pointed at the paperwork, accepted the cash, and glanced once more at the house as though relieved to be rid of it. There was no ceremony, no congratulation. Only the quiet weight of a transaction that felt less like a purchase and more like a transfer of responsibility for something no one else wanted to touch. Word traveled faster than he did. By the time he returned to the nearest town for supplies, people were already talking. He heard it in the half-lowered voices behind him in line and in the open stares that did not bother pretending to be polite. Someone had posted a photo of him standing in front of the house with the caption asking how long he thought he could survive out there. The comments multiplied within hours, jokes piling up like kindling. A few people drove past the clearing just to honk or shout something they would not repeat in daylight. He did not answer any of it. He returned to the house with a borrowed generator, some tools, bottled water, canned food, and a blanket that still smelled faintly of his old apartment. When he stepped inside for the first time as the owner, the floor groaned under his weight like a warning. Dust drifted through shafts of light from holes in the ceiling. The air carried the scent of rot and something else he could not identify, a faint sweetness buried under mold. He chose a corner where the boards seemed less eager to give way, and laid down the blanket. Night fell early in the forest, shadows crawling up the walls until the house was nothing but the sound of wind threading through broken spaces. The first night was not about comfort, but endurance. He listened to the structure argue with gravity in soft pops and creaks, felt cold air slide under the door that no longer sealed anything, and wondered how long stubbornness could keep a man alive. Outside, someone parked on the road long enough to shine headlights through the empty windows, then left. He did not follow the car with his eyes. He lay there, staring at the beams of the ceiling that sagged like tired shoulders, waiting for morning to give him permission to move again. He began the work at dawn, not because he had a plan, but because movement was easier than thinking. He cleared debris, stacking broken boards outside and sweeping away leaves that had claimed the floor. Each touch sent small avalanches of dust down around him, and the house responded with quiet protests. By mid-morning, he found the first beam that did not look like the others. Its surface was smoother where the years had worn away splinters, and beneath the grime he noticed marks that were too deliberate to be random. He scraped gently and felt his breath stall as letters emerged. They were carved with a child's careful unevenness, names and dates etched as if someone had tried to hold time in wood. He stepped back, suddenly aware that the house was not just collapsing timber and forgotten furniture. It was a container. Whatever stories it held had survived fire, storms, neglect, and now the curiosity of a man who had nowhere else to be. Outside, another car slowed, someone leaning out with a phone to capture his silhouette through the empty window frame. The video would be online before he finished brushing the dust from the letters, adding him to a growing archive of public amusement. He did not turn around. He traced the name again with his finger, feeling the shallow groove as if it were a pulse. By evening, he had found more. In different rooms, on beams that had been hidden behind layers of decay, the same pattern appeared. Clusters of names, dates close together, then a gap, then more. He photographed them, not to share, but to remember, and wrote them down in a notebook he had used once to keep track of grocery lists. This felt different. The house was not laughing at him, and for the first time in months, neither was he. The names he had discovered on the beams followed him into sleep and back into waking. When morning came again, it arrived thin and gray, the kind of dawn that makes everything look unfinished, as if the world itself were still deciding whether to stay. He rose from the blanket, stiff with cold, and stepped carefully across the warped boards, now aware that every room might hold something more than rot and dust. The house was no longer only a shelter, however temporary. It had become a question that refused to be put down. Survival came first, though. The forest did not care about mystery, only about weather and hunger. He learned the house the way one learns a wounded animal, slowly, watching where it flinched. Some corners were dry even after rain, others funneled cold air straight from the broken eaves. He cleared one room enough to place a folding table and the small generator he had carried from town, running an extension cord through a hole in the wall because the door no longer closed properly. He rationed fuel, turning the machine on only when he needed light or to charge his phone long enough to download maps and archive searches for later, when the signal allowed it. Water became a daily pilgrimage. A narrow trail led from the clearing down to a stream that cut through the woods, its surface dark with leaves but clean enough to filter. He carried bottles back in a backpack that once held gym clothes, now repurposed for survival. Food came in cans that rang hollow when opened, their metallic echoes strangely loud in the quiet house. He ate sitting on the floor because the chairs he found had legs that folded under any weight, their wood softened by moisture and time. The house resisted his presence as if it were embarrassed by being seen this way. Every board he touched shed fragments. Nails loosened without warning. One afternoon, as he leaned against a support beam while prying away old paneling, the beam shifted and a shelf above collapsed, missing his head by inches. The sound of it echoed through the empty rooms like a reprimand. He stood there, breathing hard, heart pounding, aware that the internet would never know how close its favorite joke had come to ending. The thought did not make him angry. It made him careful. That care deepened his attention. He began to notice patterns in the way the house failed and the way it held. Some beams were rotted nearly through, others preserved as if by intent. He followed those differences, working with a patience he had never known when he lived in spaces that were designed to be easy. And each time he uncovered another cluster of names, another set of shallow carvings, the work felt less like demolition and more like archaeology. At night, the forest pressed close, its sounds amplified by the broken walls. Something small skittered across the floor more than once, and once he woke, convinced that footsteps circled the house, only to find in the morning the marks of deer hooves in the soft earth outside. Isolation gnawed at him in ways he had not expected. In the city, loneliness had been crowded. Here it was vast, a hollow that the echo of his own movements filled. He fought the urge to drive back into town just to hear voices, because he knew he would carry the house with him, its questions heavier than anything he could leave behind. He organized the names into pages in his notebook, copying them carefully, adding the locations where he found them. Some dates clustered around certain years, others stood alone, and the gaps between them felt deliberate. The more he wrote, the more the house began to look less like a ruin and more like a ledger. There were days when he forgot to check the comments under the videos people still posted about him. Days when the world beyond the clearing shrank to the sound of his breath and the scrape of metal on wood. One afternoon, as rain threaded through the broken roof and pooled in the corners, he noticed something odd about the chimney. Its bricks were darker in one section, their alignment too neat for a structure that had surrendered everywhere else. He brushed his hand over the soot and felt the faint outline of something beneath, a seam that did not belong to accident. The discovery sent a tremor through him, not fear exactly, but anticipation, the way a locked door suggests there is something worth protecting behind it. Outside, a pair of teenagers had parked near the clearing, laughing loudly enough for him to hear through the walls. He ignored them and returned to the chimney, tracing the seam again and again, as if the repetition might teach him what to do next. The house was not done with him yet. He sensed that with a clarity that had nothing to do with evidence. It was a feeling, the same one that had led him here, deepening now into resolve. Whatever lay hidden in this place, he would uncover it, not to answer the laughter of strangers, but to satisfy the quiet insistence growing in his chest that this ruin was more than a joke. The seam in the chimney refused to leave his thoughts. He tried to focus on practical work the next morning, telling himself that curiosity could wait until the house was less likely to collapse on him. But the idea of something hidden so deliberately inside that column of brick was like a splinter beneath the skin. It followed him as he fetched water from the stream, and again when he boiled it on the camping stove he had set up near the one window that still held half a pane. Even the names on the beams seemed to tilt toward the chimney now, as if they were pointing him in that direction. By afternoon, he had gathered enough tools to begin. He shut down the generator to save fuel, working in the slanted light that filtered through the broken roof. The chimney crumbled easily at first, the outer layer of brick disintegrating under the gentle insistence of his pry bar. But the section with the darker bricks resisted, their mortar less fragile, their placement too careful. He slowed, aware that impatience could destroy whatever was behind them, and chipped away with the precision of someone who has learned that accidents are not forgiven here. When the opening finally gave, it was not a dramatic collapse, but a small surrender. A few bricks loosened, revealing a cavity no wider than his shoulders, and inside it something wrapped in cloth, its shape unmistakably intentional. He reached in with hands that felt too large for the moment, drawing out a bundle tied with twine that had long since faded from any recognizable color. Dust bloomed into the air as he set it on the floor, coughing softly as if the house itself were exhaling. The cloth fell away to reveal a metal box, its surface mottled with rust but still solid, its latch stiff with disuse. He sat back on his heels, listening to his own breathing echo off the walls. For a moment, he did nothing, letting the reality of the discovery settle, aware that once he opened it there would be no returning to the simplicity of not knowing. The laughter of strangers felt distant now, a memory from another life. The latch resisted him at first, then yielded with a dry snap. Inside, packed carefully as if for a journey that had never come, were cassette tapes, their labels handwritten in a neat but hurried script, along with envelopes whose edges were frayed and soft from time. Beneath them lay a handful of photographs, faces partly obscured by age or by deliberate cropping, children standing in doorways or clustered together in rooms that looked impossibly like the one he was sitting in now. He carried the box to the table and arranged its contents in the weak daylight. The tapes fascinated him most, relics from a time when voices were trapped in plastic and ribbon, waiting years to be heard again. He owned nothing that could play them, and the realization stung with urgency. The house had waited decades. He could wait a few more hours. It took him the rest of the day to make the trip into town, coaxing his phone into life at the edge of reception to search for the nearest place that might still sell or lend such obsolete equipment. A pawn shop at the far end of Main Street yielded a battered tape recorder that smelled faintly of cigarettes and oil. He paid without haggling, returned to the car, and drove back through the forest with the box on the passenger seat as if it were a person who needed to be watched. Night was falling by the time he connected the recorder to the generator and fed the first tape into its slot. The machine whined briefly, then settled into a steady hum that felt louder than any of the house's protests. When the voice emerged, it was quiet at first, blurred by static, then gradually clearer, speaking in a cadence that suggested care rather than performance. The words were not addressed to anyone in particular. They were reports, fragments of days stitched together by necessity. He heard mention of children arriving at night, of keeping lights low, of moving before dawn. The speaker never described himself as a hero, never named the danger directly, but the fear was there, coiled beneath every sentence. He sat there long after the tape ended, staring at the darkened walls, imagining those nights, the house full not of emptiness, but of breath held in common. When he opened the envelopes next, he did so with reverence. The letters were short, written in hands that shook or rushed, full of instructions that betrayed intimate knowledge of children who were about to vanish from their mothers' lives. A favorite song to hum if the crying would not stop. A warning about a stutter or a fear of dogs. A plea to tell a story a certain way so that sleep might come. The photographs made it worse, Or better, he could not tell. Children, standing on the very threshold he had crossed without thinking, their expressions caught between trust and confusion. He noticed how often their faces were partially hidden, cut from the frame or shadowed by the photographer's angle, as if anonymity itself had been a form of protection. Outside, headlights flashed briefly through the broken window. Someone had parked again, the curiosity of strangers turning the clearing into a spectacle. He did not rise to confront them. Instead, he shut off the generator and let the darkness return, aware now that he was not alone even when the house was empty. The past had found its voice, and he was the only one listening. As he returned the tapes to their box, he found among them a small scrap of paper with a name written on it. It was not a child's name. It was the name of the man who had recorded the tapes, the one to whom the letters were addressed. He said it aloud once, testing how it felt in his mouth, and felt a faint shiver of recognition he could not yet explain. The house had more to say, and it was clear now that it would not be satisfied with fragments. The name on the scrap of paper stayed with him through the restless hours that followed the tapes. He repeated it silently while trying to sleep, letting its unfamiliar syllables echo against the names carved into the beams, wondering how a man could exist so vividly in voice and handwriting and yet be so absent from every story the town told about this place. The house seemed to lean closer in the darkness, as though it were listening too, waiting to see whether he would be brave enough to follow where it led. Morning brought a pale light and the steady drip of rain leaking through the roof, tapping the floor in uneven rhythms. He worked without breakfast, driven by a sense that the chimney had been only an invitation, not the revelation itself. The tapes had spoken of routes and nights and children whose names were never spoken aloud. Somewhere in this ruin, he was certain, lay the words that had never made it onto plastic ribbon. The attic was the last place he had avoided, not because it frightened him more than the rest, but because it felt like a boundary, a ceiling to how much he was willing to disturb. The ladder groaned as he climbed, its rungs sticky with old resin that clung to his palms. Dust thickened the air above, each breath tasting of decay and neglect. He moved slowly, careful where he placed his weight, until he stood beneath the lowest beam of the roof, a space so low that he had to crouch to avoid brushing his head against the rafters. It was there that he noticed the wall that did not belong. Amid the chaos of slanted boards and crumbling insulation, one section looked almost deliberate, its planks aligned in a way the rest of the house had long ago forgotten. The wood was darker, protected somehow from the rot that had claimed everything else. He pressed his palm against it and felt nothing give. It was not a barrier built by time. It was a barrier built by hands. The first plank came away reluctantly, its nails screaming softly as they left the wood. Behind it was darkness, not the void of open space, but the dense stillness of something sealed. He pulled the next board free, then another, and a faint scent of old paper reached him, so different from the moldy odor that dominated the house that it might as well have come from another world. His heart began to pound in his ears as he cleared enough of the opening to reach inside. What he drew out was not a box, but bundles, dozens of them, each wrapped in ribbon or twine or nothing at all, their edges yellowed and soft. They filled his arms until he had to descend the ladder again and lay them on the floor below, arranging them in a rough circle around the table as if afraid that separating them might break something fragile and unseen. The first letter he opened was written in a careful script that tried to look steady. The words were simple, stripped of anything that was not necessary. A mother introduced herself only by first name, gave the name of her child, his age. the way he pronounced certain words wrong. She apologized for the trouble she was causing, apologized for existing in a world that had taught her that apology was the price of hope. The letter ended not with gratitude, but with instruction, a small map of how to keep her child alive when she no longer could. He read another and another, each different in tone, but identical in urgency. Some were long, rambling, as if the writer could not bear to let the pen stop moving, as if silence were a luxury she no longer possessed. Others were no more than a paragraph, written in a hand so shaky that he could imagine the circumstances of their creation. A door half open, footsteps in the distance, the fear of being seen overriding the desire to say everything. As he sorted the letters by date, a pattern emerged. They clustered around certain years, mirroring the names on the beams and the entries on the tapes. This was not a single act of mercy frozen in time. It was a sustained effort, a secret network condensed into the confines of this decaying house. The magnitude of it settled on him like weight, bending him forward over the table until his forehead nearly touched the wood. There were lists among the letters, scraps of paper covered in shorthand that might once have made sense to the man whose name he had found. Routes marked with arrows, names crossed out or circled, addresses abbreviated to the point of code. He realized with a start that this was a blueprint for disappearance, a manual for erasing children from the reach of a hatred that had tried to claim them. Hours passed unnoticed. Rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof until the sound became a kind of static. He did not feel cold or hunger. He felt only the steady accumulation of lives pressing into his awareness, refusing to be reduced to artifacts. And then he found the letter that changed the shape of everything. It was tucked inside a bundle that had come apart at the ribbon, its envelope more worn than the rest. The name on it stopped him. It was the name his grandmother had carried before she married, a name he had not seen written in years. His breath caught as he unfolded the paper, recognizing the small details the writer included, the ones that had survived in family anecdotes stripped of context. A tiny birthmark behind the ear, a habit of hiding toys under the pillow, a fear of thunder that had haunted his grandmother even in old age. The room blurred. He sat down hard on the chair that creaked beneath him and read the letter again, this time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they did not. They remained a mother's farewell to a child she was about to lose in order to save. The house, he understood now, was not a place he had stumbled upon. It was the reason he was here at all. He held the letter until the paper warmed under his fingers, then pressed it to his chest, as if that might bridge the distance of decades. The laughter of strangers, the videos, and the mockery, all of it fell away in the face of this knowledge. The house was not only a ruin filled with ghosts, it was a threshold his own blood had crossed, and he was standing on it now, tasked with a responsibility he had never asked for but could not refuse. The letter did not leave his hands when night came. He sat in the one room that still offered a suggestion of shelter and read it again under the weak yellow glow of the generator, tracing the ink as if his fingers might uncover more than the words were willing to give. His grandmother had never spoken about that year. She had told stories of gardens and old songs, of a childhood shaped by small, safe memories that never wandered near fear. Now he saw how carefully those stories had been chosen, how each omission had been a form of protection extended across generations. Morning found him already dressed, the letter sealed in a plastic sleeve he had salvaged from an old binder, tucked close to his chest. The forest was quiet as he drove back toward town, the road unspooling beneath his tires like a challenge he was finally ready to accept. He no longer moved with the aimlessness that had brought him here. Every mile carried purpose now. Every stop, a step toward assembling a history that had been buried because too many people had decided it was safer not to remember. The library was nearly empty when he arrived, its long tables scattered with newspapers that no one had touched in years. He asked for the archives without explaining himself, and the librarian pointed him toward the basement with a nod that suggested she had long ago stopped being surprised by what people sought among old records. The room smelled of paper and dust and something faintly metallic, as if time itself left a residue. He spent hours hunched over reels of microfilm, scrolling through headlines that spoke in the careful language of avoidance. Riots became disturbances. Disappearances were reclassified as relocations. Fires that destroyed whole blocks were attributed to faulty wiring without further investigation. Between the lines, he found what he needed: dates that matched the clusters on the beams, brief mentions of children who were never seen again. There were no stories of rescue, only absences disguised as accidents. The name from the tapes appeared once, in a column so narrow it was easy to miss. It was attached to a report of a house fire on the outskirts of town, the property owner listed as deceased, cause undetermined. The date was one of the blank spaces in the ledger of names he had built back at the house, a gap that now felt like a wound. He copied it down, heart pounding, aware that this was the closest the town had ever come to acknowledging the man who had made the house a sanctuary. By the time he left the library, the sun was already angling toward afternoon. He drove to the courthouse next, navigating corridors that smelled of cleaning solution and old bureaucracy, requesting birth records, name changes, anything that might tie the past to the present. The clerk was bored enough to be helpful, sliding files across the counter with little comment, and there it was. His grandmother's name appeared twice in the same year, once as the child she had been born as, once as someone else's daughter entirely, the signature of a judge stamping over her first life with the authority of law. The drive back to the house was a blur. He did not remember the trees or the ruts in the road, only the pressure building behind his eyes as he tried to reconcile the woman he had known with the girl who had once hidden in these walls. Memories reassembled themselves in new configurations: her insistence on sleeping with the radio on, her aversion to closed doors, the way she flinched at sudden footsteps. These were not quirks, they were scars. He carried the documents inside as if they were fragile, laying them out on the table beside the letters and the tapes. For the first time since he arrived, he saw the house not as a question, but as an answer, one that had been waiting for him to learn the language necessary to hear it. He moved through the rooms differently now, not as an intruder, but as a descendant returned to a place that had shaped him before he was born. The decision formed without debate. There would be no renovation that erased the truth of what had happened here, no sale that turned memory into profit. The house was not his to claim in the way ownership usually worked. It belonged to the children whose names were carved into its bones, to the mothers whose letters trembled with hope, to the man whose voice still lived on plastic ribbon. His role was not to possess, but to protect. That night, he began to write again in the notebook that had once held grocery lists, this time not copying names, but planning a future for the house that honored its past. He did not yet know how he would find the others, how he would trace lives that had been deliberately obscured, but he knew he would try. The laughter from the internet no longer reached him here. The house had given him his own name back, and with it a purpose he could not abandon. He began the transformation quietly, without announcements or explanations, working from the inside outward, as if afraid that speaking his intent too loudly might cause it to vanish. The notebook filled with sketches that were less about architecture than about memory, rough floor plans overlaid with the names he had copied from the beams, arrows tracing the path a child might have taken from the door to the hiding place beneath the stairs, circles marking where letters had been found. He did not want to rebuild the house into something unrecognizable. He wanted to hold it in the precise moment before it had begun to die. The first repairs were invisible to anyone driving past the clearing. He shored up the foundation from beneath, crawling through a crawl space that reeked of damp earth, setting new supports next to the old ones so that the house would not forget where it had leaned. He replaced only the beams that could no longer carry weight, leaving those with carved names exposed, protected now by sealant rather than buried under paneling. The generator gave way to a small solar panel he mounted on the one section of roof that still caught light, not because it was efficient, but because it felt right to let the house power itself again. He rebuilt one room at a time, working until his hands blistered and his shoulders burned, then working some more because stopping felt like betrayal. In what he believed had once been the main living space, he recreated the atmosphere he had seen in the photographs, dim and contained, with curtains that could be drawn tight and lamps that cast only enough light to keep the dark from closing in completely. This was not design. It was translation, an attempt to render into present form the past that had been preserved in paper and wood. Between days of construction, he wrote letters of his own, not to children this time, but to institutions and organizations that might hold the faintest echo of the people he sought. Historical societies, churches, adoption agencies, whose records had outlived the staff who created them. He explained nothing he did not have to, only that he was searching for individuals connected to a house that had once offered shelter when the world had none. The responses came slowly, some polite refusals, others filled with curiosity that bordered on fear, as if the very act of remembering might disturb something better left alone. The first real conflict arrived in the form of a man who parked at the edge of the clearing and waited until he emerged with a stack of boards balanced on his shoulder. The offer was made in the careful language of opportunity, a sum of money that would have solved many of his immediate problems. The man spoke of development, of potential, of how easy it would be to tear everything down and start fresh. He listened until the end, then shook his head, the refusal costing him more than he was willing to admit. The man left without argument, but the look he cast back at the house was one of calculation rather than disappointment. That look returned in different guises over the following weeks. Letters from lawyers appeared in his mailbox in town, suggesting zoning issues he had not considered, hinting at the possibility of eminent domain if the property were deemed unsafe. He responded with documentation of his repairs, with applications for historical status that he submitted in person, standing in offices that smelled of toner and impatience until someone agreed to process his request. The house had survived hatred. It would not fall to paperwork. Gradually, the answers he had hoped for began to arrive. An email from a small museum curator who had found a reference to the house in an old ledger, a phone call from a woman who believed her father had passed through this place as a boy. Each message carried the same cautious tone, as if they were stepping across a threshold that might not hold. He invited them not to the clearing but to speak first, to share what they remembered, and with each conversation the notebook grew heavier with new names, new threads that connected the fragments he had assembled. The opening took shape without fanfare. He did not set a date at first, only told those he had contacted that the house would soon be ready to receive them. He created spaces within the rooms, areas where letters could be read in silence, where the tapes could be heard without spectacle. The wall of names became the spine of the house, each carven preserved, each story attached not as an exhibit, but as a continuation. Outside, the tone of the internet shifted. The videos now showed something other than collapse, glimpses of fresh boards and windows that no longer stared empty at the forest. The laughter dulled, replaced by questions, by a curiosity that had not been there before. He did not respond to any of it. The house did not need validation from a world that had once refused to see it. The night before he considered the work complete, he walked through every room with the lights off, letting the moon trace the shapes of what had been. The house felt different now, less like a survivor clinging to its last breath and more like a place that had decided to live again. He paused at the wall of names, touching the carving that matched his grandmother's letter, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt something like peace. The first visitor arrived before the house had any official opening, before he had finished convincing himself that the rooms were ready to hold what was about to happen inside them. He recognized the car from the cautious description given in the email, the way it slowed long before reaching the clearing, the driver sitting still for several seconds as if weighing whether to turn back. When the door finally opened, the man who stepped out moved with the uncertainty of someone approaching a place that exists more vividly in memory than in reality. They stood together in the doorway for a moment, not speaking, the house absorbing the sound of two people breathing the same air after so many years. He led the man inside, past the table where letters rested under glass, toward the wall where names were carved into beams that had once borne the weight of children who were now old. The man scanned the wood with an intensity that bordered on fear, and then his eyes stopped moving. He leaned closer, fingers hovering just above the letters as if afraid that touching them might make them disappear. The recognition did not arrive as tears at first. It came as stillness, a silence that filled the room so completely that even the forest beyond the walls seemed to hold its breath. Then the man's shoulders shook and he pressed his forehead to the beam, his body folding inward in a way that had nothing to do with age. He did not need to explain what he was feeling. The house had already done that work for him. Word spread quietly after that. The man did not post about his visit, did not turn it into a story that could be shared without context. Instead, he called people, others who had grown up with questions that never had answers, whose lives had begun with a gap that no one knew how to fill. They arrived alone or with family members who had only ever known fragments of what their parents had endured. Each time the clearing filled with another car, the house felt less like a museum and more like a gathering of lives that had been interrupted and were now tentatively reconnecting. He watched as visitors moved through the rooms he had restored, seeing not the craftsmanship but the echoes. Some recognized the layout immediately, turning corners without guidance, led by a memory that had waited decades for a place to land. Others lingered over the letters, searching for handwriting they might remember, finding in the words of strangers the same fear that had shaped their own childhoods. People brought objects with them, small tokens that had survived moves and marriages and the erosion of time, placing them on the table not as offerings, but as confirmations that what had happened here was real. The room with the letters became a sanctuary of its own. Visitors sat there longer than anywhere else, reading the words of mothers who had loved their children fiercely enough to let them go. Some traced lines with their fingers, others closed their eyes, listening to the tapes that carried a man's voice across decades. The house did not offer resolution. It offered recognition, and that proved to be enough. Not everyone came in peace. He noticed familiar faces from the town, people who had once leaned out of car windows to laugh, now entering with their heads lowered. They moved through the rooms carefully, as if expecting accusation to rise from the floorboards. Some left quickly, unable to reconcile the ruin they had mocked with the weight of the stories it contained. Others stayed, standing before the wall of names longer than any of the survivors, confronted not with a history they had lived, but with one their families might have shaped. It was during one of these visits that a woman approached him with a question she had been carrying for years. Her father had died without ever explaining the night he disappeared from his home as a child, leaving behind a family that searched until searching became a habit rather than a hope. She had found his name carved into the beam, recognized the date, and felt something inside her settle. The house had not reunited them, but it had closed a circle that had been open too long. As the days passed, the visitors grew more numerous, and with them the stories multiplied. He listened when they wanted to speak, recorded what they were willing to share, never pushing beyond what they offered. Some described the man who had hidden them as if he were a shadow. Others remembered his hands, his voice, the way he moved through the house without sound. One elderly woman, her posture bent by years that no one had meant her to have, spoke of seeing him leave one night and never return, of the smell of smoke in the morning and the terror that followed. The pieces began to assemble into something darker than he had imagined. The fire reported in the paper was no accident, and the silence that followed was not ignorance but erasure. The man whose name had been on the scrap of paper had not vanished quietly. He had been made to vanish, his sacrifice absorbed into a narrative that allowed the town to continue without discomfort. He realized then that the house was doing more than returning memories. It was unsettling them, drawing into the open truths that had been buried alongside the beams and the letters. The visitors did not leave lighter. They left changed, carrying with them the knowledge that survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that still demanded to be told. The official opening arrived without ceremony, as if the house itself had chosen the day rather than any announcement he might have made. Morning light fell through the rebuilt windows in narrow bands that settled across the wooden floor like signatures, and the clearing filled slowly, cars lining the road in a way he had never seen before. There were journalists, of course, their cameras hanging from their shoulders like shields, but they stood uncertainly at the edge at first, sensing that this was not a place that welcomed intrusion. Families came, too, some with children who held their parents' hands tightly, as if the walls might still shift beneath them. He opened the door and stepped back, letting the house speak for itself. People entered quietly, their conversations trailing off as soon as they crossed the threshold, confronted with the wall of names that greeted them before anything else. The carved letters had been preserved exactly as he had found them, protected now from decay but not from sight. He watched as visitors leaned closer, reading not only the names but the dates, the small clues that hinted at journeys begun in fear and continued in secrecy. The journalists moved more slowly than they were used to, their usual hunger for spectacle dulled by the atmosphere that resisted easy framing. Some put their cameras away entirely, content to stand and listen as survivors spoke among themselves, the murmur of recognition threading through the rooms like a second voice layered over the first. When interviews did happen, they were quiet, almost reverent, stripped of the urgency that defined their profession. The house did not permit haste. As the day unfolded, documents he had uncovered were displayed alongside the letters and tapes connecting the personal stories to the public record that had tried to obscure them. Visitors traced the progression of events, seeing how disappearances had been renamed, how a fire had been allowed to erase a man who had made too many people uncomfortable. The narrative that emerged was not one of isolated cruelty, but of collective complicity, a web of small decisions that had enabled a larger wrong to persist unchallenged. He stood near the back room where the tapes played in a loop, watching as people listened to the voice that had guided children through the night. Some closed their eyes, letting the cadence carry them. Others stared at the floor, unwilling or unable to look up. When the name of the man who had made the house a refuge was finally spoken aloud by one of the visitors, it moved through the space like a current, recognition spreading from face to face as if the sound itself were a form of restoration. Late in the afternoon, a group of older residents from the town arrived together, their expressions a mixture of defiance and dread. They moved through the rooms with the stiffness of people walking through their own reflection for the first time, confronted not with the ruin they had once dismissed, but with the legacy they had inherited. One woman stopped abruptly at the wall of names, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized a surname that matched her own. She did not speak, but the color drained from her face, and those around her understood without explanation that the past was no longer content to remain buried. The effect rippled outward. Conversations started in corners, hushed at first, then more urgent as visitors compared what they were learning with what they had been told growing up. The house did not accuse. It revealed, and in doing so, forced a reckoning that no one had prepared for. The laughter that had once followed him here was nowhere to be found. In its place was something heavier, an acknowledgement that the land itself remembered, whether people chose to or not. When the crowd finally thinned and the clearing grew quiet again, he walked through the rooms alone, absorbing the residue of the day. The house felt changed, no longer defined by the absence that had once haunted it, but by the presence of voices that had returned. He paused at the wall of names and added one more carving beneath the others, not his own, but the name of the man who had started it all, setting it into the wood with care so that it would endure. Outside, the forest closed in around the clearing as it always had, indifferent to human triumphs and failures. But the house stood differently now. It was no longer a ruin waiting to be reclaimed by vines and weather. It was a place that had insisted on its own survival, carrying within its beams the proof that even when people try to erase the past finds a way to speak. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now and stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Watch the next story and explore others you won't believe. And make sure to share this video so your friends can see it too.